The global geopolitical landscape is simmering with undercurrents in 2026. Conflicts spill over in Eastern Europe. Tensions rise again in the South China Sea. Greenland has become a new focal point of the game between Europe and the United States. And the chip battlefield is even more intense. These seemingly scattered hotspots are actually closely intertwined to reshape the world pattern. Today, we will unravel the threads, clarify the ins and outs of these key games, and understand the logic of the great power rivalry behind them. Let's start with the escalating Russia-Ukraine conflict. In addition to ground and air confrontations, the game of energy sanctions and counter-sanctions has entered a new phase, with Britain and the United States stepping up efforts to contain Russia's shadow tankers. Some of you may not know what shadow tankers are. In fact, they are a fleet of tankers that Russia has set up to evade Western sanctions and maintain oil exports. These tankers sell Russian oil to third countries by changing their flags, turning off tracking devices, and transferring oil between ships on the high seas. To plug this sanctions loophole, Britain has recently passed special legislation explicitly allowing its Navy and Air Force to intercept, board, inspect, and even strike shadow tankers linked to Russia on the international high seas. This is a significant escalation signal. Previously, Western sanctions were mostly implemented within their own territories and territorial waters. But now the scope has been directly expanded to the international high seas, marking that Western energy sanctions against Russia have begun to become militarized. Ukraine, on the other hand, is not sitting idle. It has adopted an offensive defense strategy and taken the initiative to launch drone attacks on Russian-linked tankers at Kazakhstan's ports in the Caspian Sea. It should be noted that Kazakhstan is a neutral country. The attack on its ports has suddenly added new variables to the regional situation. Ukraine's goal is clear: to strike Russia's energy transportation links and weaken its oil export revenue. You should know that energy exports account for about 40% of Russia's federal budget and are the core economic pillar supporting its war machine. Ukraine wants to form an economic strangulation of Russia through such precise strikes combined with Western sanctions and containment, forcing Russia to make concessions on the battlefield or even cease fire directly. Another point worthy of attention is that Musk's SpaceX's Starlink system is playing an increasingly prominent role in global geopolitical games. Starlink has previously provided services to Venezuela and recently started providing free satellite internet services to Iran. On the surface, this seems like a good thing to ensure information freedom and facilitate people's communication. But in depth, the international community generally questions that this is serving the US geopolitical intervention agenda. Think about it. Both Iran and Venezuela are long-term targets of US sanctions, and both countries have strict domestic internet control measures. The internet services provided by Starlink are highly stable and anti-interference. They can not only help local opposition forces break through information blockades but also provide hidden communication channels for US and its allies' intelligence agencies. In fact, the US government has publicly admitted to providing funding support for Starlink services in Ukraine. And now Starlink has become the core reliance for battlefield communications of the Ukrainian military. Extending Starlink services to Iran this time is essentially a new means of flexible intervention by the US with the help of private enterprises. It aims to shake the ruling foundation of target countries through information penetration and provide technical support for its own geopolitical strategic goals. This model of enterprise-empowered geopolitical intervention blurs the boundary between private forces and state actions, bringing new challenges to global geopolitical security and triggering widespread controversy about the ethical responsibilities of technology enterprises. After talking about Eastern Europe, let's turn our attention to the Asia-Pacific region. Currently, the collusion between Japan and the Philippines in the South China Sea is becoming more and more frequent, directly escalating regional games. On January 15, 2026, Japanese Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi specially visited the Philippines, which currently holds the rotating presidency of ASEAN. This timing is quite deliberate. The content of the consultations between the two sides focused highly on defense security and regional cooperation. and finally signed 3 important agreements to further consolidate the strategic partnership between the two countries. According to the joint statement issued by the two sides and subsequent disclosed details, the core highlight of this defense cooperation is to promote consultations on the Philippines' purchase of Japan's Type 03 medium-range surface-to-air missiles, and also sign the agreement on reciprocal provision of supplies and services between the armed forces of the Philippines and the self-defense forces of Japan. This agreement can complement the previously reached reciprocal access agreement, which can significantly enhance the coordinated combat capabilities and combat readiness of the military forces of the two countries. In addition, Japan also promised to provide the Philippines with 900 million yen in official security assistance for the 2025 fiscal year, approximately 341 million Philippine pesos, specifically to support the Philippines' national defense modernization process. At the same time, it will provide 1.63 billion yen in gratuitous assistance, about 617 million Philippine pesos, to build a wireless broadband network in Basilan, Sulu and Tawi-Tawi provinces of the Sulu Islands in the Philippines. Although this infrastructure project seems to focus on people's livelihood, it actually hides strategic considerations. The Sulu Islands are near important waterways in the South China Sea. Improving the communication network here can greatly facilitate maritime monitoring and intelligence sharing between Japan and the Philippines. On the South China Sea issue, Japan, taking this visit as an opportunity, clearly proposed to promote the formulation of a binding code of conduct in the South China Sea, and also wanted to use the Philippines' rotating presidency of ASEAN to include maritime security issues in ASEAN's annual priority agenda. As we all know, ASEAN and China have been consulting on the code of conduct in the South China Sea for many years. The core of the existing framework is non-binding, emphasizing the resolution of differences through dialogue and consultation. However, the binding code strongly promoted by Japan essentially intends to introduce more stringent dispute settlement mechanisms and external supervision clauses to restrict China's legitimate rights and interests claims in the South China Sea. Japan is not a coastal country of the South China Sea, but it frequently interferes in South China Sea affairs. Its deep-seated strategic intention is clear. On the one hand, by strengthening defense ties with ASEAN countries such as the Philippines, build a regional security network to contain China and curb the power projection of the Chinese Navy in the South China Sea. On the other hand, link the South China Sea issue with the Taiwan Strait issue, and use the internationalization of the South China Sea issue to force China to make concessions on the Taiwan Strait issue. During the visit, Japanese Foreign Minister publicly stated that the peace and stability of the South China Sea are closely related to the situation in the Taiwan Strait, and any unilateral action to change the status quo should be opposed. This statement directly exposed their attempt to interfere in China's internal affairs through the South China Sea issue. From the perspective of regional impact, such intensive collusion between Japan and the Philippines is making the South China Sea situation more fragmented and confrontational. There have always been differences of interest within ASEAN. Countries such as Cambodia and Laos have always adhered to a neutral stance and advocated resolving South China Sea disputes through dialogue, while countries such as the Philippines and Vietnam are closer to Japan and the United States and tend to introduce external forces to balance China. Now, with the help of the Philippines' rotating presidency of ASEAN, Japan is forcibly competing for the agenda-setting power on maritime issues, which is likely to lead to the division of ASEAN and undermine the cohesion of ASEAN as a regional cooperation platform. In addition, the upgrading of defense cooperation between Japan and the Philippines may also trigger a regional arms race. Currently, the Philippines is accelerating its national defense modernization. In addition to purchasing missiles from Japan, it is also negotiating with the United States to increase the use rights of military bases, while Japan continues to expand its military influence in Southeast Asia through official security assistance and other methods. This approach of strengthening alliances through force runs counter to the expectation of peace and stability in the South China Sea. and will only further increase the risk of regional conflicts. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has stated on many occasions before that it opposes any country interfering in other countries' internal affairs and exacerbating regional tensions through the South China Sea issue, and advocates that sovereign states directly concerned resolve differences through equal consultation and jointly maintain peace and development in the South China Sea. Next, let's talk about a relatively unpopular but strategically significant game point: Greenland. Recently, because former US President Trump made a tough statement with military threats against Greenland, Denmark has joined hands with Germany, France, Sweden, and Norway to send military personnel to Greenland to explore relevant measures to strengthen security. There are fundamental differences between the United States and Denmark on the Greenland issue. The joint countermeasure by many European countries this time is mainly to prevent the United States from meddling in this important area that has both strategic waterway and rare mineral resource value. First, let's introduce the basic situation of Greenland. It is the largest island in the world, most of which is within the Arctic Circle. It is an autonomous territory of Denmark with a high degree of autonomy, but its defense and foreign affairs have long been dominated by Denmark. In recent years, with the melting of Arctic ice, the strategic value of the Arctic waterway has become increasingly prominent. Once this waterway is fully opened, the maritime transportation distance between Europe and Asia can be shortened by thousands of kilometers, and it will become an important part of the global shipping system. At the same time, Greenland is also rich in rare earths, graphite, copper, nickel, and other key mineral resources. These resources are the core raw materials for the new energy industry and chip manufacturing. Under the background of global energy transition and technological competition, its strategic importance is self-evident. The United States has long paid close attention to Greenland and has the Thule Air Base on the island, which is a key node of NATO's Arctic defense system, mainly used to monitor Russia's missile launch activities. Trump's recent statement on Greenland has directly caused widespread shock in the international community. He publicly claimed that Greenland is crucial to U.S. national security and will take all means including force to safeguard U.S. interests if necessary. This highly threatening remark has been called the most illegal land claim in modern history by Denmark and many European countries. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen clearly stated that Denmark is currently in a decisive moment of diplomatic games with the United States and will defend its values in the Arctic and any other necessary areas. Rasmus Jarlov, chairman of the Defense Committee of the Danish Parliament, even said bluntly that if a military conflict breaks out because of Greenland, it will be the stupidest war in history. In response to U.S. military threats, Denmark took the initiative to coordinate Germany, France, Sweden, and Norway to promote the preparation for sending military personnel to Greenland, carry out preliminary preparations for NATO joint operations such as Arctic Sentry, and explore security. Strengthening measures such as joint patrols, military training, and infrastructure construction. As of January 13, 2026, consultations between relevant countries have entered a substantive stage, and the United Kingdom has also clearly stated that it is considering sending soldiers, ships, and aircraft to Greenland. Although British officials describe these discussions as routine matters between NATO allies, the outside world generally believes that this is a clear signal of joint countermeasures by many European countries against the United States. There are fundamental differences between the United States and Denmark, including between the United States and Europe on the Greenland issue. The core demand of the United States is to strengthen control over Greenland. On the one hand, it wants to expand the scale of the Thule Air Base and enhance its military presence in the Arctic region to respond to Russia's military deployment in the Arctic. On the other hand, it hopes to control the development rights of key mineral resources in Greenland through economic assistance and investment, breaking China's dominant position in the global rare earth market. Denmark and many European countries are most worried that excessive U.S. intervention will disrupt the existing balance in the Arctic region and damage Europe's geopolitical interests. European countries have been promoting Arctic strategic autonomy in recent years. hoping to coordinate Arctic affairs through the framework of the European Union and NATO. As an important fulcrum of Europe in the Arctic, Greenland is the key for Europe to achieve its Arctic strategic goals. In addition, European enterprises have made a lot of investments in Greenland. If the United States forcibly intervenes, it is likely to cause losses to the interests of European enterprises. More importantly, the US's previous raid on Venezuela enforced control of other countries. Leaders have made European allies more vigilant about its hegemonic logic, worrying that Greenland will become the next target of the US's maximum pressure strategy. From the perspective of subsequent impact, Greenland has become a touchstone to test the US-Europe alliance. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock has clearly stated that she will focus on discussing the Greenland issue and NATO's role in the Arctic region. When meeting with the US Secretary of State, hoping to resolve differences through diplomatic channels. But the core interest conflicts between the two sides are difficult to reconcile in the short term. For Greenland itself, this great power game has put it in a dilemma. On the one hand, Greenland is eager to achieve economic development through resource development and external cooperation and get rid of economic dependence on Denmark. On the other hand, it is worried about becoming a pawn in the great power game and losing the dominant power of independent development. The Greenland Autonomous Government has stated on many occasions recently that it advocates international cooperation on the premise of maintaining neutrality, and opposes any country deploying nuclear weapons or provoking military confrontations in Greenland. It should be noted that the peace and stability of the Arctic region are of great significance to global climate and geopolitical security. If the game between the United States and Europe in Greenland continues to escalate, it will not only damage the cohesion of the transatlantic alliance but also may trigger an arms race in the Arctic region, bringing new uncertainties to the global geopolitical pattern. Let's turn our attention to the Middle East again. The negotiations on the security agreement between Israel and Syria have now reached a deadlock, with the course stuck on the two issues of the withdrawal of troops from Mount Hermon and the presence of Russian troops. Israel has clearly stated that it will not give up Mount Hermon, directly leading to the stalemate in the negotiations. At the same time, political unrest has also emerged in Syria. The cancellation of the president's interview by Shams Channel has caused widespread controversy, and the European Court of Justice has also maintained sanctions against Syrian businessmen, further increasing the uncertainty of the Syrian situation. Specifically, starting from early January 2026, Israel and Syria held two rounds of security agreement negotiations in Paris, France. The core issue of the two sides is to implement the 1974 disengagement of forces agreement and reach a long-term security arrangement on this basis. According to reports from the Syrian Arab News Agency, the Syrian delegation, led by Foreign Minister Faisal Mekdad of the Transitional Government and Director of the General Intelligence Directorate Hussein Salama, clearly proposed that Israel must withdraw from all Syrian territories occupied after December 8, 2024, including the military buffer zone on the Golan Heights and the strategic Mount Hermon, and at the same time require Israel to stop airstrikes and infiltration activities in southern Syria. But Israel put forward tough counterconditions, directly leading to a deadlock in the negotiations. Among them, the ownership of Mount Hermon has become the primary crux of the negotiations. Mount Hermon is located at the junction of Syria, Israel and Lebanon, with an altitude of more than 2,800 meters. It is a strategic high ground in the Middle East. Controlling this area can effectively monitor the military movements of the three surrounding countries. After the drastic changes in the Syrian political situation, Israel occupied key areas of Mount Hermon and built it into an important military outpost. On January 14, Israel's Edith Aronith quoted official sources as clearly stating that Israel's position is clear and there is no room for negotiation. Not a single soldier will be withdrawn from Mount Hermon. Israel believes that Mount Hermon is the lifeline to ensure the security of its northern border. which can effectively curb the infiltration of Hezbollah and Iranian-backed armed forces from Syria to Israel. Syria, on the other hand, insists that Mount Hermon is an inherent territory of Syria, and the occupation of Israeli troops violates international law and UN resolutions, which is the core obstacle to the conclusion of a peace agreement between the two sides and must be withdrawn unconditionally. On this point, the two sides are tit for tat, with no room for compromise. In addition to Mount Hermon, the issue of the presence of Russian troops in southern Syria is another major controversial focus. The Syrian government has previously requested Russia to restart Russian military patrols in southern Syria to curb Israel's continuous air strikes and armed infiltration, but this request was firmly opposed by Israel. Israel stated that the deployment of Russian troops in southern Syria will directly threaten its freedom of action, and also require the Syrian government to commit to never having advanced air defense systems and other strategic weapons to achieve complete demilitarization of southern Syria. Israel also specifically communicated its position to Damascus, Moscow, and Washington, stating that it will not allow any foreign military forces to be deployed in southern Syria, worrying that the presence of Russian troops will strengthen the strength of the Syrian government and thus affect Israel's strategic advantage in the Middle East. Although the two sides agreed in a joint statement on January 6 to establish a joint integration mechanism, supervised by the United States to cool down the situation through intelligence sharing, this mechanism does not touch on the two core issues of the withdrawal of troops from Mount Hermon and the presence of Russian troops, and cannot promote substantial progress in the negotiations at all. At the same time, political unrest in Syria is further increasing the uncertainty of the situation. On January 15, Syria's Shams channel, based in the Iraqi Kurdish region, suddenly announced the cancellation of the scheduled interview with Syrian transitional president Ahmad Sharif. This news immediately caused widespread political and media controversy. Eli Nakuzi, the channel's director, explained the reason for the cancellation by saying that President Sharif's remarks on the Syrian Democratic Forces (SDF) in the interview were intense and inciting, and he was worried that the broadcast would escalate the conflict between the Syrian Arab Army and Kurdish armed forces, resulting in more casualties of innocent people. It is reported that this interview was recorded shortly after the end of the conflict between the Arab Army and Kurdish armed forces in the Aleppo region. In the interview, President Sharif expressed strong dissatisfaction with SDF leader Maslom Abdi, clearly stating that he would not make more concessions beyond the previous agreement. The Syrian Ministry of Information subsequently issued a statement criticizing Shams channel's decision and stating that it may broadcast the interview through official platforms. This controversy has further exposed the deep-seated contradictions between different factions in Syria. In addition, the European Court of Justice has recently maintained sanctions against a group of Syrian businessmen who are accused of providing economic support to the Syrian transitional government. The continuation of sanctions will further exacerbate Syria's already severe economic difficulties, lead to the deterioration of people's livelihood issues, and bring greater challenges to the stability of the situation. After talking about military and geopolitical games, let's talk about the core focus in the field of science and technology and economy, the adjustment of US chip control policies. Recently, the new regulations targeting H200 chips have officially taken effect, changing the previous policy of blanket refusal to case-by-case review, but at the same time setting strict conditions such as a 50% export quota to China, mandatory third-party testing, and end-user control. To put it bluntly, this is not a real relaxation, but a combination of limited relaxation plus stricter supervision. Behind this adjustment is the long-term game between the market protection and technology containment factions in the United States, and it also involves policy coordination with allies such as Japan and the Netherlands. Whether the subsequent rules will change depends largely on the speed of China's semiconductor-independent progress. This quantitative red line directly limits the proportion of the Chinese market in the shipments of U.S. enterprises, and does not want China to become the main consumer market for U.S. advanced chips. Second, there is a mandatory third-party testing requirement before departure. Each batch of exported chips must be sampled and tested by a qualified third-party laboratory based in the United States and having no interest relationship with both parties to verify whether their technical parameters meet the control standards. This requirement greatly increases the export cost and time cost of enterprises, and also gives the U.S. government direct monitoring power over exported chips. Third, there is strict end-user and use control, which clearly prohibits the use of chips for military or weapons of mass destruction-related purposes. And the final consignee must implement strict customer identification procedures. If used for cloud services, it is also necessary to submit a list of all remote end users to BIS and prevent model weights or algorithms from being transferred to unauthorized parties. This forms a full-chain control system of pre-export review, in-export monitoring, post-export traceability. In addition, the new regulations also require exporters to prove that the supply of products in the U.S. is sufficient. Exports to China will not cause delays in orders from U.S. customers, and global foundry capacity will not be diverted for production for China, further restricting the export flexibility of enterprises. Behind the U.S. adjustment of chip policies this time is the long-term game between the two major factions of market protection and technology containment in the country. On the one hand, chip enterprises represented by NVIDIA and AMD are facing enormous market pressure. China is the world's largest consumer market for AI chips. The previous presumption of denial policy has led to a sharp drop in NVIDIA's market share in China's AI chip market from 95%, and the enterprise's revenue has been hit hard. NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang has publicly called for the relaxation of export controls many times, emphasizing that a complete embargo will only force China to accelerate independent research and development, and eventually lead to U.S. enterprises completely losing the Chinese market. On the other hand, the tech hawks in the U.S. Congress are worried that the export of advanced chips will help China's AI and military technology development and have promoted the Secure Chip Act, requiring that the export of advanced chips to China shall not be approved for at least 30 months. This case-by-case review plus strict conditions plan is the balance point sought by the U.S. government between these two demands, allowing enterprises to export some non-top chips to China to ease revenue pressure, while preventing the abuse of technology through strict controls to slow down the process of China's chip independence. It is worth noting that the U.S. policy adjustment this time also involves policy coordination with allies such as Japan and the Netherlands. Currently, the core equipment and technology of the global semiconductor industry chain are mainly controlled by the United States, Japan, and the Netherlands. The United States has previously promoted allies to implement synchronized chip controls against China, but the industrial interests of these three countries are different, and the policy pace is not completely synchronized, resulting in a contradiction of high goals and low coordination. For example, the Netherlands ASML is worried that excessive controls will affect its global market share and has a cautious attitude towards the export control of some advanced lithography machines. The U.S. adjustment of policies this time also hopes to provide clearer policy references for allies through the precision control model and promote the formation of a unified technology blockade alliance against China. In addition, the new regulations also introduce a controversial 25% sales sharing mechanism, requiring enterprises such as NVIDIA to hand over 25% of their H200 chip sales in China to the U.S. government, euphemistically called the Technology Development Fund, which is actually used to subsidize domestic semiconductor research and development. This mechanism has triggered a controversy in Congress about whether it is unconstitutional, further highlighting the complexity of the domestic policy game in the United States. From the perspective of impact, this policy adjustment has had a significant impact on Chinese and American enterprises and the global industrial chain. For U.S. chip enterprises, although they have obtained a limited channel to re-enter the Chinese market, they need to bear high compliance costs, and supply chain management and customer screening capabilities have become core competitiveness. For Chinese enterprises, in the short term, they can ease the pressure of high-end AI computing power shortage through compliance applications. It is reported that NVIDIA plans to deliver the first batch of 5,000 to 10,000 sets of H200 8-card modules, about 40,000 to 80,000 chips, before the 2026 Spring Festival. But in the long run, they still face the risks of unstable supply, high procurement costs, and technical dependence. The China Semiconductor Industry Association has clearly stated that the introduction of chips is only to ease the short-term gap. The determination to localize will not waver. And at the same time, we must be vigilant against the volatility of U.S. policies. In the future, whether the U.S. control policy can be sustained depends on three dynamic factors. First, the domestic political game in the United States. Congress may promote new legislation to strengthen the supervision and accountability of chip exports. Second, the trend of Sino-US technological competition. The progress of China's semiconductor independent capabilities will directly affect the adjustment pace of U.S. control thresholds. Third, the degree of policy coordination among allies. If Japan, the Netherlands, and other countries do not follow up with synchronized controls, the effect of U.S. blockade will be greatly weakened. Overall, the game in the chip field has entered a long-term confrontation stage of precision, control, and independent breakthrough, which will profoundly affect the restructuring direction of the global semiconductor industry chain. Finally, let's integrate these scattered hotspots to make an overall combing and summary. The core feature of the current global geopolitical pattern is the parallel of regional confrontation, spillover, and alliance cooperation. The great power game has extended from the traditional military field to multiple dimensions such as resources, science and technology, and geopolitical space. There are three main risk points. First, the spillover of the Russia-Ukraine conflict to Poland and the Caspian Sea region. Second, the uncertainty of the South China Sea situation has increased significantly due to the collusion between Japan and the Philippines. Third, Greenland may become a new friction point between Europe and the United States. The key variables affecting the overall situation are the volatility of U.S. domestic politics and its policy towards China, the response strategies of multipolar forces such as China and Russia, and the continuous deepening of supply chain regionalization and de-dollarization. From the perspective of the overall evolution of the global geopolitical pattern, the core trends at present are the simultaneous advancement of regional confrontation spillover and alliance cooperation strengthening. The traditional military confrontation has gradually extended to multiple dimensions such as resources, science and technology, and geopolitical space, forming a complex situation of multi-line interweaving and global game. In Europe, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has evolved from an initial bilateral military confrontation into a comprehensive game involving NATO, the European Union, Russia, and other parties, and the risk of conflict spillover has been rising. Events such as the involvement of the Polish consulate in Odessa, Britain's promotion of strikes against Russian tankers on the high seas, and Ukraine's attack on neutral ports in the Caspian Sea all indicate that the impact of the conflict has exceeded the Russia-Ukraine border and spread to Central and Eastern Europe and the Caspian Sea region. The upgrading of NATO's military deployment on the Eastern Front has further intensified the military confrontation with Russia. If the strategic miscalculations of both sides continue to accumulate, it may trigger a larger-scale regional conflict. In the Asia-Pacific region, the South China Sea situation has become increasingly complex and uncertain due to the intensive collusion between Japan and the Philippines. With the help of the Philippines' rotating presidency of ASEAN, Japan is forcibly promoting a binding code of conduct in the South China Sea, wanting to internationalize and ideologize the South China Sea issue. This approach of introducing external forces to balance regional powers is likely to trigger camp confrontation within the region. Currently, with the support of the United States and Japan, the Philippines is accelerating its national defense modernization, continuously expanding the use rights of military bases and frequently conducting joint military exercises. This forms a direct confrontation with China's normal rights protection actions in the South China Sea, which may lead to an increase in the frequency of maritime friction incidents. More notably, Japan also wants to link the South China Sea issue with the Taiwan Strait issue. This attempt may make the two hot issues interact with each other, further amplifying regional security risks and undermining the overall situation of peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific region. In the Arctic region, Greenland has become a new focal point of the game between Europe and the United States, and may become a new friction point of the transatlantic alliance. To control the Arctic waterway and the key mineral resources of Greenland, the United States has not hesitated to issue military threats to its allies. This hegemony-first logic has a fundamental conflict with Europe's pursuit of Arctic strategic autonomy. Denmark's joint military personnel dispatched to Greenland with Germany, France, Sweden, Norway, and other countries to carry out joint security cooperation is essentially a joint countermeasure against the U.S. maximum pressure strategy, which also highlights the differences between Europe and the United States on Arctic interests and global strategies. The transatlantic alliance has been the core support of U.S. global hegemony since the Cold War, but in recent years, differences in trade, energy, geopolitics, and other fields have continued to expand. If the game in Greenland continues to escalate, it may further weaken the cohesion of the alliance, promote Europe to accelerate the pursuit of strategic autonomy, and then reshape the balance of power in the global geopolitical pattern. From the perspective of key variables affecting the overall situation, the volatility of U.S. domestic politics and its policy towards China is the biggest source of uncertainty. Currently, there are significant differences between the two parties in the United States on China's strategy, technology blockade, geopolitical intervention, and other issues. The maximum pressure strategy of the Trump administration and the checks and balances of Congress are intertwined, leading to the U.S. foreign policy showing the characteristics of volatility and radicalism. For example, in the chip control policy, the contradiction between the president's announcement of liberalization and the legislators' promotion of blockade has long existed. In the Greenland issue, military threats and diplomatic negotiations are alternately used. This policy volatility not only makes U.S. allies at a loss but also brings great uncertainty to global geopolitical security. Second, the response strategies of multipolar forces such as China and Russia will profoundly affect the direction of the game. Russia's long-term combat capability in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the progress of China's semiconductor-independent capabilities, and the depth of cooperation between China and Russia in energy, science and technology, military and other fields will all form checks and balances on the U.S. hegemonic strategy and promote the evolution of the world towards a multipolar pattern. Finally, the continuous deepening of supply chain regionalization and de-dollarization is reshaping the interactive logic between the global economy and geopolitics, affected by factors such as Sino-US trade frictions, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and US-European sanctions. The global industrial chain and supply chain have shifted from efficiency first to security first in the past. The trend of regionalization and localization has become increasingly obvious, and regional supply chain systems in Asia, Europe, and the Americas have gradually taken shape. This change will not only affect the growth model of the global economy but also weaken the U.S. ability to control the world through financial hegemony and technological monopoly. At the same time, more and more countries have begun to promote the use of local currency settlement in international trade, reducing dependence on the U.S. dollar. The de-dollarization process is accelerating in key fields such as energy and food. This will shake the foundation of U.S. global financial hegemony and trigger profound changes in the global financial system. The interweaving of supply chain regionalization and de-dollarization is promoting the transformation of the global geopolitical pattern from unipolar dominance to multipolar governance. This transformation process is full of games and turmoil, but it also provides new possibilities for building a more fair and reasonable international order.